Thank you, Claire Finkelstein, for, I think, one of the most important conversations of the year as we celebrate the 20th anniversary of the coming of age of the 1325, the Security Council Resolution 1325, and the Women, Peace and Security Agenda. And what 1325 and the WPS agenda has done is to redefine, reconceptualize, and reimagine security as a feminist issue. That women are no longer to be conceived as victims of war, but as agents of peace. And that the 4 pillars of the Security Council Resolution 1325, participation of women in peace building, prevention of conflict, as well as the importance of representation of women in rebuilding and in protecting women, is not only correlated, but that the participation of women as leaders in peace building needs to be privileged. So I'm going to start with the clarion call to our audience that echoes the words of Amal Clooney, the international human rights lawyer, and the charge that she made to the Security Council and to the Secretary General of the United Nations when, in representing Nadia Murad, the Yazidi woman who was held captive by the ISIS and raped countless times, and 6 of her brothers were assassinated and her mother was murdered by the ISIS. And in her representation of Nadia Murad at the Security Council, she reminded the Security Council that this is your Nuremberg moment, your chance to stand on the right side of history. So I take it that here at Penn Law 2, we take this as our Nuremberg moment, our chance to stand on the right side of history on these issues, that if we can't prevent violence against women in conflict, if we can't prevent sexual violence in conflict, we have a duty to prosecute, to punish sexual violence in conflict. So as we celebrate the 20th anniversary of this agenda, we have with us 3 women who continue to define this agenda. Women who have played a role as architects of the Women, Peace and Security agenda, but most importantly played a role in the front lines of conflict, in resolving conflict, in analyzing conflict, in preventing conflict, and preventing conflict-related violence against women and sexual abuse. But I want to first problematize some of these issues and the ways in which we are going to frame this conversation. I'm going to ask each one of them to speak about the country situations that they have been working on, but also speak from it from a polemical lens of whether the WPS agenda itself has been problematic in certain ways. There are post-colonial critiques being made of the WPS agenda, that this too is a highly militarized, securitized agenda, and not enough is done to look at it through feminist lenses, and that women are being co-opted in a very statist, very much a securitized and militarized agenda, and not enough of a vision of women as leaders and as change makers in this agenda. Secondly, looking at the WPS agenda through the lenses of preventing violent extremism and countering violent extremism, we see that gender equality and violence against women is often an indicator of impending conflict, and that growing violence against women is often not only a harbinger of conflict, but is an early warning sign of conflict. But what has happened is that in a securitized agenda, CVE and PVE, notions of the prevention of violent extremism, seem to have co-opted women in this agenda as ways in which women have been drawn together in a law and order agenda rather than a human rights agenda. So at the very heart of the WPS agenda, and as prevalent as embedded in the preamble of Security Council Resolution 1325, is language that the WPS agenda is built on the bedrock of human rights rather than a law and order agenda. So it is the human rights of women and the community that needs to be protected by the WPS agenda. So I want my panelists to look at this through that kind of polemical lens of what is wrong with the WPS agenda, what more can be done to address those gaps and to advance the WPS agenda. So I'm going to start first of all with Funmi Balogun, who is the UN Women's Representative in South Sudan. She has been at the very front lines of South Sudan's efforts to build peace. And as most of you know, South Sudan is the world's youngest country. In 2011, South Sudan achieved independence, but since 2013, South Sudan has been enmeshed in civil war, and just in 2018, the president of South Sudan sat at the peacemaking table with the vice president of South Sudan, who led the rebel efforts to carve out a peace treaty. But, you know, after 7 failed efforts at making peace and 7 failed, what I would say, peace treaties and peace negotiations, I think South Sudan's future is still evolving. And as South Sudan tries hard to build a new narrative based on peace, women have come to the forefront as peace builders. But women themselves have been disproportionately displaced by the civil war. So the impact of gender on the peace treaty is important and should be brought to the forefront. So Funmi, I want you to reflect on South Sudan's peace treaty and the ways in which Security Council Resolution 1325, as well as the corpus of 9 Security Council resolutions on women, peace, and security, including 2467, the last and the 10th Security Council resolution, which talks about the importance of context, that these Security Council resolutions need to be contextualized, has been translated and transformed in South Sudan.
Thank you, Rajita, and good afternoon, colleagues. Ladies and gentlemen. My name is Funmi Balogun, and I think I'll start from the independence of South Sudan, which was in 2011. And it's important to note that in 2011, when South Sudan gained independence from Sudan, it did not have any normative frameworks. And interestingly, Women, Peace and Security Act 1325 was actually the starting point of the frameworks for women, because of their experiences of conflict for over 30, 50 years that they had been in conflict in South Sudan. So that resonated a lot more with women and men actually of South Sudan than, for example, CEDAW. So that was an important entry point in determining what kind of society South Sudan would like emerging from conflict. And so it was, and why this was very important, the 1325, it was very important for South Sudan in 2011. It became even more important when it was developed after 20. It became more important in 2013 when it went back into civil war. Because the National Action Plan on 1325 became the framework from which South Sudanese women negotiated the peace agreement. So all the critical negotiations that had been made when the country was stable actually found the provisions then found their way into the peace agreement. So it was very important. And then South Sudanese women actually negotiated from the protection angle of the 1325. So they came into the negotiations from being survivors of conflict-related violence, which was very high, as well as the fact that they were disproportionately affected by the displacements that were happening in South Sudan. So that was what was used for South Sudanese women to come together and negotiate their way into the negotiating tables. But of course, there were very many challenges with that, in that the women were coming as observers. They were not part of the combatants and the parties to the conflict. So their negotiations were always from the outside, and it was always dependent on the combatants to accept them onto the table. And I remember in 2015, when the women were negotiating to get onto the peace table, the women had to go to all the combatants to write letters for them. This was just one practical way to say, we are okay with you joining the peace process as women. So while the talks were ongoing, the women had to go to the individual parties to the conflict and negotiate that space. So that I mean, it was innovative in a way, but at the same time, it already put women at the back foot. The other thing was that women in those parties and in the parties to the conflict were not as engaged, and there wasn't enough attention on those women to engage in the process. The other challenge was that there was a lot of focus on the prevention and looking and coming from the conflict-related sexual violence and displacement, and also in participation. And there wasn't enough on the transformation that was going to happen post-agreement. The other thing was women were not funded for this work. So all of women's engagement relied on external donors and external funding. And so it was very ad hoc, it was not consistent. But if not for 1325 that existed, that the women of South Sudan had developed and negotiated with the state, it was not going to be possible to actually have those critical issues within the peace agreement.
So thank you, Funmi. And on your point about the need for money, the Secretary General Guterres, has bemoaned the fact that only 0.2% of bilateral aid to fragile and conflict-affected situations go to women's groups. So, you know, this is, if there's any takeaway, if there's any call to action coming out of PENLAW's own engagement with 1325, it is the charge that we have to make to multilaterals and bilaterals to increase the amount of foreign aid and bilateral and development cooperation given to women's organizations in conflict. So apart from that, in South Sudan's roadmap for peace and its revitalized peace agreement, several women leaders, including your boss, Fumsili Mambo Nguka, the Undersecretary General and head of UN Women, has called it very clearly and explicitly a futile man's war. That the civil war was caused by the president and the vice president who led the ethnic groups. So in this futile man's war, women are the victims, right? The victims of caught in between the futile man's war. But women have carved out a space, as you so eloquently stated, and the peace treaty calls for 35% women's representation in parliament. So what it shows is that the power of 1325 is not only in conflict resolution and in peacekeeping, but in post-transitional justice situations, in rebuilding and reimagining a new narrative for South Sudan and other countries that are in the grip of conflict. So can you speak to that rebuilding part of 1325?
Thank you. Yes, the 35% is is still very contentious, and it hasn't been fulfilled yet, but that was part of the thing. It's in the parliament as well as the executive. Actually, when it was negotiated, it was supposed to be within all the transitional governance, including the judiciary, including all appointees, must have at least 35% of women. That has been pushed back by the parties to the conflict, but it's an important gain. It's very critical for a country that is highly patriarchal, like South Sudan, and women have not, even though making 60% of the population because of all the wars, they have not been in the level of participation in public spaces have been very low. And even in terms of education, still less than 20% of women in South Sudan are formally educated. So you can imagine, so there's one instance of 35% of women in public decision making, but there is also the challenge of how do we fill those positions with women because of the systematic discrimination against women that have been ongoing. So, but it's an important thing that we have, and we know that we're going to have incremental increase, that at least there's a target of 35% that we can hold the government accountable to. But at the same time, there are very many issues around security sector reforms that are in the peace agreement, transitional justice, and how do we get the systems to reform and make sure that all this respond to the needs of women. Security sector reform, for example. What does security mean for women? And so that's part of the work that is ongoing now with women's organizations. What does it mean for security? We know 1325, there's been the critique that is very security conscious, the traditional mode of security. But in South Sudan, we are taking it a notch further to say we want to reform the security sector in South Sudan, but we want to base it on women and men's priorities and needs. What do they consider security? And how can we then make those into state institutions that are not just going to be military, that are going to be killing people and raping, which is the way we see the military right now.
So unlike the Convention on the Elimination of Discrimination Against Women, the WPS agenda has brought together both Republicans and Democrats. And Condoleezza Rice introduced Security Council Resolution 1820, followed by Secretary Clinton with the support of Ambassador Milan Verviers, who introduced Security Council 1888. And both Security Council resolutions and both leaders introducing these resolutions defined sexual violence as a tactic of war. And recently, in introducing the 10th Security Council Resolution 2496, Secretary General Guterres really complicated the definition by saying misogyny is a tactic of war. So not just sexual abuse, but misogyny itself can be a tactic of war used by violent extremists. So I think that was a very important expansion of what constitutes violence. And so with that, I want Farnaz, who's worked both in Pakistan on issues of countering violent extremism when she was the human rights advisor to the president of Pakistan, President Zardari, and now at the Woodrow Wilson International Center for Scholars, where she was my very esteemed colleague, where she's been working on jihadis and gender, as well as, the ISIS and violence. I want you to look at the ways in which Security Council Resolution 2242, because 10 years ago, in commemorating the 10th anniversary of the WPS agenda, 2242 looked at ways in which the WPS agenda must be expanded to cover violent extremism. So it was not only conflict, an impending conflict, but violent extremism, and the ways in which violent extremism impacts women and women's role in violent extremism. So you have some polemical thoughts on gender and violent extremism that I want you to share with us.
Thank you. I'm going to frame this between two countries, two bodies of land. So it's going to be a little different in scope, and I want everyone to excuse me for my voice and if I'm a bit woolly-headed today because I've risen from my sickbed of bronchitis. So the two countries that I'm going to talk to you about, one is Pakistan, a highly militaristic state, which has, from its founding, been run by the military, whether you have a democratic government or not, and therefore the role of women in that society, in any case, could not be equal to begin with. And secondly, within those parameters, talking about countering violent extremism, the tribal belts of Pakistan, where there are movements by nationalities that want more rights and want more freedoms, where the military has been accused of raping women in those areas as a way of subduing populations, etc. So on the one hand, you have this country which has laws, which is a part of the United Nations and is not a rogue state. And even within that country, you see the military on one hand, which affects this so-called free parliament and democratic ways, and then you see those parts of the country that, like the tribal areas, where people have no rights and no laws. And to compare and contrast it to the territory that ISIS or ISIL took over in Iraq and Syria, and how they took the women who were specifically the women who were of different religious faiths, women who were Yazidi, women who were Christian, and women who were Shia, who they considered equally non-Muslim. And in both these countries, in a state constituted along the lines that we're talking about, and in this new kind of Sharia state, when you talk about countering violent extremism, in both cases, you see that women, there's no equality in either of these kinds of systems today. What we see today is what I've worked on a lot, and I call it majoritarianism. And so you have two forms of majoritarianism. One is that men in the corridors of power or in the battlefields and their power nexus. And the second is women who belong to religious minority groups are doubly impacted. They're doubly vulnerable, which is what you saw and you're seeing again now in the ISIS areas. Now, in both these cases of Pakistan and the ISIS former territories, which they are now starting to try to regain, you see the role of the world. Now, the UN can pass, there's a whole WPS agenda, there's 2242, we're talking about 1325 and the two major points that it deals with. The impact of violent conflict and war on women and girls, as well as the crucial role that women should. I will not focus on already do play, because in these scenarios I'm talking about, they're not even able to play a significant role. So where these two situations, I would say, the world has really failed women. And the world today, you were talking about these mechanisms. If the United States could just walk out of the territory of ISIS, to leave them to regroup under a new leader, leading back to all of the issues that the Yazidi women in particular suffered. The slaughter of their men, being buried alive, gang raped, forced marriages. And today what they're dealing with is their children are being forcibly taken away from them. Because the Yazidi community thinks of these children as the spawn of the devil. And their theological leaders have talked about the fact that these children cannot come back. These are the children of murderers. So now look at these women. They're women, they're minorities, they have lived through rape and war and attrition of every kind. And now they're being told that their children do not belong to them. So for the last 10 years, since we have been talking about women and human rights and, combating violent extremism, where was the world for these Yazidi women? And where is the world today? For me, it is what I see on the ground. Security Council resolutions, and I'm so sorry to say this, and I know this is going to not be politic, but I believe you have to put your money where your mouth is. And if you look at the United Nations Human Rights Council today, and you see who the members of that council are. This is one area I agree with President Trump. All those countries are not friends of women. They're not friends of gender, and they're not friends of a responsible way forward. So I ask you, in the lens that we have, a world where we're seeing things falling apart in the United States as well as all around the world, how do we use these resolutions to actually have some effect in the areas that I'm talking about?
So my students have also been grappling with that, and how do we enlarge the term women? Who gets to constitute the term woman, right? And you spoke so eloquently about, minority women. Minority women pay the highest burden of conflict and war. LGBTQ women pay the consequence of war, and we saw that in Colombia. But still the term woman has not been defined by the Security Council resolution. So we need another Security Council resolution that looks at that, but because of the composition of the Security Council itself, this is highly problematized and political in defining, in defining woman, the term woman, sex, and gender. And I think that is at the very heart of this. But this year, we have seen, and this is done through CFR's data collection, both an uptick in terrorism and in counterterrorism in Africa and around the world. So I think this conversation comes at a very important moment, not only at a time when we are marking an important turning point for 1325 and its progeny, but at a moment when we are redefining violent extremism and US foreign policy and national security. So, Irene, you have led the world's largest intergovernmental organization on the rule of law, and as part of your leadership, you've helped to rebuild a transitional justice agenda in Afghanistan by improving and strengthening women's access to justice and reform of the justice sector, including independence of the judiciary. You worked in several countries in sub-Saharan Africa and in Kenya and in Liberia. So what I wanted to do is to look at the ways in which 1325 has been applied in very concrete ways and real life stories of the women that your work has affected. So I've been studying, and my students have been studying, some of the national action plans that have been drafted by states parties. So for example, the Afghanistan National Action Plan, which lasts through till 2022, calls for the involvement of men and boys in the fight against all forms of violence against women. So the engagement of men in what was traditionally thought of to be a women's space is very important. And there is from strengthening women's active participation in election to increasing women's participation in decision making. So the franchise, so something as, fundamental as the franchise for women, and something as important as women's participation in decision-making, in law enforcement, and in parliament is part of the National Action Plan of Afghanistan. So that is an important part of it, but I also want you to look at the ways in which, and this is in the Pakistan's, the monitoring report of Pakistan's National Action Plan, the hyper-masculinized vision of counterterrorism in our country has not ensured security to all citizens, including women. So this is really at the heart of the flaw, the fatal flaw of the Security Council resolutions, that it's still hyper-masculinized, and we still look at it from a hyper-militarized lens rather than a feminized lens. And that is why I applaud Claire for defining this conversation as a feminist conversation on national security and global security. So, how do we really counter that hyper-masculinized vision? Because that does more harm than good on the ground. Here in the United States, we don't see the ways in which this hypermasculinized counterterrorism efforts impact the real lives of women in the field. So, Irene, yes.
Okay. Let me start by saying that I have had a very interdisciplinary profession. For 20 years, I worked for the UN High Commissioner for Refugees on humanitarian issues. The focus was in saving lives. We didn't look at peace, security, women. We just looked at saving people from immediate danger. Then I went to head Amnesty International. And there it was upstream work advocating for change. And through naming and shaming, through documenting human rights violations. And then from there, I moved to head the International Development Law Organization, which is an intergovernmental organization, not an NGO, working on rule of law and development. So humanitarian issues, human rights, development. So there are three lenses through which I tend to see problems, given my own background. And I believe, I think Farnaz thought she was committing heresy, but I think I will do worse than her here, because I would say that neither the Women, Peace and Security Agenda nor Security Council Resolution 1325 should be seen as a cookie cutter that produces results across the board for everyone. It doesn't. And if you talk about national action plans, 82, by last September, 82 UN member states had them, of whom only 43% had an allocated budget for implementation. And when you went a little deeper, you found that these national action plans create awareness, but they produce much less in terms of results. So I like to believe I'm a practitioner masquerading as a policy person, sometimes as a policy person masquerading as a practitioner, but from what you see on the ground to what happens in UN Security Council rooms or in the corridors or in foreign ministries of developed countries, there's a huge, big gap. And I'm going to try to highlight that by using two examples. You mentioned Afghanistan, but I would also like to talk about Kenya. Now, Kenya doesn't usually fall into our thinking about fragile states that need help of the Security Council. But not so long ago, Kenya was subject to enormous political violence. It's had a long history of violence going back to its colonial times, and that violence in post-colonial times has been mixed up with very highly ethnically driven politics between the different political parties, and also historical grievances over land, over discrimination, about equal sharing of resources, and tactically using political violence as an instrument to gain power. So you have all these things happening in one of the major economies, one of the major countries, major powers of Africa. And what happened in 2009 was, 2007 actually, was enormous electoral violence, political violence that took place because of a rigged election. People believed it was an enormously rigged election. And people were out in the streets, and within days, thousands of people had been killed, 350,000 people had been displaced, and one of what had been considered as a major power in Africa was suddenly being destabilized. Everyone woke up. We can't let this happen, because you can see this happening in Somalia and it doesn't affect the world, but if it happens in Kenya, it's going to have global impact. We can't have it. And regional powers came together, the African Union, the international community. International Mediation Commission was set up, headed by Kofi Annan, and it included Graça Machel and the former president of Tanzania, Ben Mkapa. And they had a very consultative process with civil society, with women's groups, with others, and with the political parties, with two objectives. One was immediately stopping political violence, and the other was dealing with the root causes of the grievances. And they set up a very elaborate structure of commissions on various issues, from reforming the constitution to looking at institutions to looking at truth and reconciliation and so on and so forth. So they covered the whole spectrum as a result of the broad consultation that they had, that then led to a draft constitution, one of the best constitutions in Africa. Implementation may be another issue, but certainly in terms of what it was, which went to a referendum, people voted for it. So there was buy-in. And that then, and the International Development Organization was very heavily involved in helping the drafting of the Constitution, then its implementation. And implementation means introducing new laws from across the board. It was about mining laws, it was about land laws, it was about looking at matrimonial property rights of women. And this Constitution, the most innovative thing in it was gender equality. And as a result of this huge involvement of civil society and women's groups, gender played a very big part in it. And there is even a provision that no gender shall be represented more than 2/3.
So I think I'm going to just have a pause on that, because that is such a revolutionary statement, because as constitutional scholars, we constantly struggle with a provision on affirmative action that is not gender neutral because of the Equal Protection Clause. But the way in which Kenya dealt with it was to ensure that this was gender neutral, that there should be adequate representation of both genders, and that both genders should be represented at 30%, right? That at a minimum of 30%. So what it did was, in effect, envision a time when men may be underrepresented. So making sure that there is affirmative action and temporary special measures for men, for male participation in parliament. So I think it's a very, very, very effective way of negotiating that provision on quotas for either sex in parliament.
Yes, and that was because of the way in which the consultations took place. Long before the International Independence Commission had come into play, Kenya had a very strong civil society, a strong women's movement going back decades. And so they were already looking at how peace could be brought to the country. And they realized that the only way you do that in a multi-ethnic, diverse country like Kenya is by bringing everyone around the table. And so the women's groups, they did a fantastic job through big coalitions that went into national consultations, assemblies, and so on. And there are a couple of things I also want to point out.
So given the fact that Kenya is a good case study, and given the fact that there was a strong civil society that mobilized behind the building of the Constitution and post-conflict agenda, what were the factors that led to the failure in Afghanistan?
Well, before I come to Afghanistan, let me tell you what worked in Kenya. It wasn't, yes, the women groups and civil society participation and openness, but there was openness on the side of the mediators. And the mediators, there were three key mediators: Kofi Annan, the former president of Tanzania, and Graça Machel of South Africa.
Who is Nelson Mandela's former widow, right?
And prior to that, the First Lady of Mozambique, and she herself, of course, is a well-known advocate and women's and children's rights. Now, she opened the door for women to come in and present their cases to the mediators. She helped women draft the memorandum in which they made references to the African Union resolutions, to UN Security Council resolutions, but also to the real problems on the ground. So that was critical, the participation of women as mediators.
So real problems on the ground, and I share this vignette with my students in every class, how when they took the consultative process to the villages, there were women who got up and said, even a bird has a nest. How is it that I do not have a house over my head, a roof over my head, when a bird on a tree has a nest? Therefore, make sure that housing rights are written into the Constitution. So how they vernacularize these rights provisions.
So there was a context that was positive because of the long history of civil society work, the openness, and public buy-in. The people bought into the agenda. If you look at Afghanistan, it's a very, very different situation there, where the situation, if you look at women's groups, they are beleaguered. They are under attack constantly. It's a very small, nascent women's movement, if you want to put it that way. It's a country that has terrible statistics on sexual and gender-based violence. Kenya does too, but in Kenya, the other thing was the institutions. The Constitution required an entire revamp of the judiciary. And that is where my organization was heavily involved, my former organization was heavily involved in doing that. So today you have a very strong, independent judiciary in Kenya, which actually gave a decision on the election, previous election, against the incumbent president. And the judiciary has survived because people have trust and confidence in the judiciary. So the government didn't like the results, but didn't dare dismiss the judiciary. So you had strong institutions. If you look at Afghanistan, on the other hand, the institutions are weak. So it's very difficult with weak institutions to make progress on women, peace, and security. So there are some fundamental differences there. But we should not forget the progress that is being made despite those constraints. And that's why I'm saying the context is very important. You cannot compare Kenya to Afghanistan, but there are some lessons that one can draw and see to what extent it works. In Afghanistan, there are more women, more girls going to school now than ever before. There are 6,000 judges and law enforcement officials that are women. There are very large numbers of professional women that have come through in the last 20 years or so. I visited Afghanistan in the 90s when Kabul was being bombed by extremists, as with UNHCR at that time, the High Commissioner for Refugees. I went there in the early part of the century under President Karzai, and more recently under President Ghani. And every time I've gone there, I've seen that progress being made. But what's happening on the political side? On the political side, there is a process of negotiations going on with the Taliban. Security is very bad. There was a time, my own organization, my previous organization, IDLO, we have a large program in Afghanistan funded by the US State Department, a brilliant program to promote processes and systems to address sexual and gender-based violence.
So I'm going to ask you to stop on that, because I know that that both Funmi and Faranas want to intervene and respond to that. So Funmi, can you speak very quickly on Kenya and the issues in Africa in terms of women's participation and women's leadership, and then Faranas, you on Afghanistan and Pakistan? Yes.
Thank you. I actually worked in Kenya for 8 years, and I was leading the Gender and Governance Program during the process that Irene explained, so I do have some context.
Yes.
And in terms of, I think the difference, and Irene had said it, that in terms of Kenya, one common thread in Africa, at least in East Africa, is that most of the critical reforms and change to the governance have actually come out of conflict in Uganda, Rwanda, Kenya, and hopefully South Sudan. Most of the countries have come out of conflict. And with Kenya is slightly different because Kenya already had strong institutions. It was a dictator, but the institutions were more or less working. And the conflict came out of disputed elections, even though we had all of those issues. So it was from the, after the change from dictatorship to multi-party democracy that provided an opportunity for women and other citizens of Kenya to actually come up with a constitution. So by coming up with a constitution that responded to challenges of the past 25 years, they were able then, when there was a conflict after the elections, they were able to activate those processes to resolve the conflict and move the country on a positive trajectory. And this is what so the 1325, yes, it has all sorts of challenges, but the thing is that it does provide a framework when you are emerging from conflict.
Absolutely.
To be able to focus, especially, like you said, on the institutions, and to bring people together to say, what do we need going forward? But that will also be dependent on who takes over the leadership post that will make it work or not. So Kenya had a system, elections. South Sudan, for example, hasn't got one. So we are still, even though we have a very good peace agreement, very few people are optimistic that is going to lead to any major reform, at least in the short term. Maybe longer term, that might change. But the thing is that conflict provides an opportunity to change. And 1325 and the other resolutions provides frameworks for women to lead and put their voices into the negotiations and make sure that all of the reforms happen and they benefit women.
Absolutely. So some of the strongest constitutions that we have seen have come out of post-conflict, and those strong institutions that you both talked about are a result of 1325, as well as the ways in which these leaders have created justice systems and legal institutions that are enduring. So I'm going to ask Farah Naz to respond in terms of Pakistan and Afghanistan.
Now, I think we just really come down to the previous panel had a fascinating conversation about feminism, the word feminist versus gendered, and how that was working in an international context. And I think I agree with more or less the consensus there that, perhaps you see that countries like Finland and Sweden, which are really at one end of the highest end of progress, can talk about these gendered efforts and work on them in that way. But when you're looking at a country like Afghanistan, and I'll compare Afghanistan and Pakistan here, I think the key thing is the leadership of women. What brought Pakistan forward to some degree, I would say? What made a difference? What did not happen in Afghanistan? What happened in India, Pakistan, and Bangladesh? Women leaders. And those women leaders left behind, during their time, women police forces, women health workers, women in every strand of life, supporting civil society, supporting the women's movement, etc. So these women leaders brought all of this to the table. Afghanistan never had that. And unfortunately, Afghanistan today, again, we come back to a US foreign policy problem with the troop withdrawal. You come back to a situation where the US ambassador, Zalmay Khalilzad, did not think it was crucial to insist that women leaders were included in talks with the Taliban. He did not even feel that the elected government had to be included in the talks till very recently. So again, when you have to, you can't just talk the talk, you have to walk the walk, And so I think in that way it's undermining the US's own moral position or the West's moral position. But I do feel that this is a difference. Women's leadership, the lawmaking in Pakistan in the 5-year term that I served there, we just had our leader, Benazir Bhutto, assassinated, and so we very much wanted to complete our agenda. So in one 5-year term, we passed more pro-women and pro-children laws than at any other time. But it didn't end with us. We've had 2 male prime ministers since then, and they're still working on the acid law. We're seeing the 3rd iteration. So it hasn't fallen by the wayside. Once you give people something to work with, so that would be. Irene, I think you wanted to.
Yes. So, and I want to thank Farah Naz. She served as a parliamentarian in President Zardari's administration and was a very close friend of Benazir Bhutto. So, you continue, even from the United States, working on the feminist agenda in Pakistan.
Yes.
1 minute, and then I'm going to turn to the audience for questions.
Start with your last sentence, feminist leader. I think we need to be careful that we do not equate women's leadership with feminist leadership. Feminism has a definition. It is not about your sexual identity. It is about other things. It is about how you approach issues of human rights, equality, equity, and so on. And sometimes men can make great feminist leaders.
Yes.
And sometimes women can make terrible feminist leaders. So I think we need to keep that very, very clear in our minds. And therefore, I would say, to differ with Farah Naz, having worked in Afghanistan for almost 20 years off and on, that Afghanistan has many more serious problems than lack of women leadership. There are important women's leaders in Afghanistan. For example, until recently, the head of the National Human Rights Commission, Seema Samar, and others. There are very, very strong women there. However, what we have to recognize with Afghanistan, it has been the campaign ground for the great game. Every superpower has gone in and messed with that country for several decades now. So let's not get them off the hook. When you have that kind of a situation, you don't get social development. The social development indicators of Afghanistan are terrible. And who suffers most? Women, in terms of health, education, girls' education, and so on. There has been no great social reform taking place there. In Afghanistan, there is no law on the elimination of violence against women. Well, there is a presidential decree that was put out by the president. Why wasn't it a law? Because the president was afraid that if he took it to the Shura, to the assembly, they would push back against it. So he could not trust the so-called democratic representatives to be able to pass a law eliminating violence against women. So it was leadership from the top. It was a top-down approach through which they could push these issues.
I have to jump in here, really.
I love the fact
I saw you nodding and agreeing with Irene, and I do have to say this. I was part of the first women's parliamentary caucus in Pakistan, and we had women in that caucus from the Islamist right parties who fundamentally believed in Sharia law, who fundamentally disagreed with the way myself and my colleagues who were from a center-left party behaved, etc. But when it came to sexual harassment in the workplace laws, when it came to the acid violence laws, let me tell you, we were all feminists and we were all united, and all these bills went through our caucus. So I don't always like to see things put everything through a particular lens. Sometimes, if, for example, we had a woman speaker who greatly helped us put this caucus together, but it brought out something in all the women. They may not have called themselves feminists, but they did the right thing.
So, but by the term feminism, because I think I did influence the way in which this, we changed our name for this symposium to security as a feminist issue. Feminism is an inclusive term. It could be male leaders who are feminists. So when you call it security is a women's issue, you are excluding the men from that discourse. So by calling it a feminist issue, we see that men see themselves as feminists who are part of a transformative agenda. So I want to thank all three of you who are not only in the front lines of this discourse, all of us are in the front lines of the discourse, but few of us are in the front lines in the field, in the front lines of the action. And the three of you have really been change makers in doing that. I have 5 minutes for questions. So, and I'm going to take the questions in a way that really inspires all of us to take action on the transformative agenda, which is 1325. Yes, you had a question? Yes.
I'm just ready with a microphone.
Oh, okay, great. Yes. Any questions? My students have questions. So, Maria, you had a question?
Yes. My name is Mariam Nasser. I'm a student here. And so my question is regarding civil society. So how do you all feel that we can support the capacity of local actors, specifically women leaders, to not only be involved in decision-making, but to serve as a sort of centrifugal force that holds the WPS agenda accountable to the commitments it makes, as well as the government accountable?
Sorry, can you, what's your question?
So how can we support the role of civil society?
Okay. I can take one more question. Yes. Good. We have a male leader here. Yes.
Were there cultural differences in Kenya and Afghanistan and Pakistan that led to the different results that Pakistan was able to have female leadership. Afghanistan still a very dominant society, and Kenya was able to work out its problems. That's the basis of long-standing cultural differences.
Okay, so you have 1 minute to answer both questions. Combine the questions and answer.
Okay. I would say one of my panelists earlier talked about institutions. I think institutions matter. If you have strong courts, if you have a strong justice system, then you have a stronger parliament, elections, all of those things. So those things do make a big difference, I would say. Into supporting civil society, what did you mean by we? Did you mean we Americans, we at the University of Pennsylvania Law School? We who?
So my question is regarding local actors on the ground.
Yes, but who did you want to support the local actors?
Activists, human rights
Oh,
activists.
on this, okay. I think there are already a lot of bridge building initiatives, but I think all those initiatives where people work directly with groups on the ground are always the most successful. Mm-hmm. I remember the Kerry Biden Lugar bill that was the first U.S. all-civilian assistance bill to Pakistan. And it was the first time there was a bill of aid for Pakistan from the American people, which had zero security component to that, right? But it became such a mess at this end with who were the big contractors, who were the big NGOs, who would dole out the money, and it got caught up in the bureaucracy, and eventually the money just dried up. So the point is the right pipeline, identifying groups who are working on the ground and allying with them. I mean, there's just such a pollination of ideas and strength. I would always say a direct, non-governmental approach.
Funmi?
Thank you. I'll start with the civil local actors, and I think there's a lot of support and resources, not enough, that goes to local actors, especially women's organizations, to organize, and that makes a difference to do all of the work. But at times, I think we also forget that states and institutions are not just buildings, and that they actually are people in those structures, and that what they believe and how they interpret the laws, the practices matter in terms of moving forward. And how do we not just, it's good to have the masses, and I think in terms of the debate around Afghanistan, my understanding is that when you have local actors and women mobilizing, women connecting, not just individual women leaders. Mm-hmm. I think that was I think that was the difference. That was the nuance I was getting, that in Afghanistan there are individual women leaders who are exceptional, but they didn't have enough
networks,
mobilization and networks of women. So the weakness is actually how do we connect the women, the actors, the civil society and the civil actors to those in power and the institutions, and to influence that. And to make that connection, so that when we are supporting them, we make that connection. Also, in terms of culture, in the different countries, looking at even South Sudan and Kenya that are next to each other, the culture and the countries are so different, in that Kenya has a very strong middle class that has resources and has influence on the state, and is able to change the state very quickly. South Sudan has a very weak, has non-existent middle class, has only the militant, or whatever, with power and guns and money, and then the rest of the society is down there without education, without skills, without resources. So it's also, when you have women leaders in those contexts, they are not able to do the mobilizing. And we also have to recognize that in some countries, in South Sudan, they have probably less than 500 kilometers of road, of tarred road, in the whole of the country. So you can't even connect.
Absolutely.
So the context, how do you support? So where do we where should we, to look at the context again and see where do we put our resources and how do we get women to connect. I think that's the most important thing, that women need to connect and connect to the institutions on how they would influence this institution.
Irene?
Okay, let me start first with the cultural differences. I fully agree for me. It's not only culture, it's also history, politics, economy, infrastructure. There are lots of things that come together that make a difference between one country on this side of the border, between Pakistan and Afghanistan, for example, right next to each other, South Sudan, or even if you take Bangladesh, my own country. In the case of Bangladesh, the war actually changed the situation in favor of women. After 1971, because of the economic disaster, women had to go out and work. And as women worked, they got economic power, things started changing. And that is why today, our leader of the opposition, our leader of the government happen to be women. Political parties are headed by women. That does not necessarily mean that they're performing any better than the male political leaders would. Let me tell you that. Sometimes it can go the other way around. But nevertheless, women are very much there. And the social indicators of Bangladesh are, in many cases, better even than India, although India is a bigger economy, much, much better in terms of maternal mortality, girls' education, health, access to health and social services, and so on. So that's been a change that has come through war, but we had war, in 1971, so there's been a long time of recovery. Time is extremely important for building institutions, and that is why when donors go in, they put the money in, they want results in a year, then I'm sorry, that just does not work. It takes years and years, and you make mistakes in the process. You take 2 steps forward, 1 step backward. It's an iterative process. That's very important to understand about development. Now, coming to civil society, I was Secretary General of Amnesty International for 9 years. Amnesty International is a global organization. Our largest national chapter was and still is in the United States. And here we were working on human rights problems all around the world. And what I realized very acutely, was the importance of local ownership, of building, of listening to people, not coming in with your ideas, especially in sensitive areas like women's rights or human rights. You don't come in with your ideas and tell people how to change their lives. You listen to them. You try to understand their problem. You share and support them to make that journey towards change. It's their journey. They have to own it. All you can do is support them. What can we do? We can make sure that there is space for civil society. Today, in almost every country in the world, that civil space, the civic space, the space for civil society is shrinking. It is because of the growth of authoritarian government systems, and Western countries, who were the greatest champions of human rights, are now supporting some of those authoritarian leaders elsewhere. So when you do that, then there is no point in putting out a little bit of development aid or sending a bit of money to this little NGO or that little NGO in that country, if you are actually at the same time then working with the government to oppress these NGOs from saying what is right, from doing what is right, from holding their own government to account. So there has to be a political strategy as well as an economic strategy to support civil society.
So I want to finally end by building on my 3 eminent panelists' words of wisdom. So when I was asked to look back on the legacy of 1325, I started at the very end. The 10th WPS resolution 2493, the last in the corpus of the Security Council resolutions on women, peace and security, which was passed on the last day of October 2019, which calls for the context, for being sensitive to the context in which 1325 is applied. And that is why I want to bring together 3 women leaders who can speak to how do we contextualize and give and privilege the importance of context in the WPS agenda. So in talking very quickly about the importance of context in civil society, my own work in advising the European Union on foreign policy directives in combating child marriage. When I first looked at the directive, I saw that it was a tripartite agreement between the European Union, the World Bank, and the United Nations. And I said, but where are the national actors? Where are the national non-governmental organizations and the civil society that Miriam was talking about? Because without that, you're doomed to fail in any kind of work that involves addressing cultural and traditional change. So the importance of civil society is really key to contextualizing the women, peace, and security agenda. And finally, I want to remind ourselves that despite all of the flaws in the women, peace, and security agenda, it is still the crowning achievement of the global women's movement. And it is the crowning achievement because it gives credence to the revolutionary idea that peace is inextricably interlinked with gender equality. And that is inexorably the idea that security is a feminized concept and that peace cannot endure without gender equality. So with that, thank you to all of you who are going to take this message forward. Thank you.